All right, Kurt, at your convenience, you can get started. Oh, if you are speaking, we're not hearing you. You may be on mute, it looks like.
All right.
Here we
Hopefully
go.
that's fixed. All right. So I am Kurt Veely. I'm the Director of Research at Berry Consultants. We thank you all for joining this FACS webinar series. Today we're going to talk about arm dropping and response adaptive randomization. You can see I'm also available on Twitter and LinkedIn. Berry Consultants, we post blogs and answer questions and various other things on social media. So we certainly take requests. The outline for today. So this is the common structure we've been using for this webinar series. We're going to talk through the basics of response adaptive randomization, RAR, and arm dropping. So what problem are we trying to solve with these methods? How do they actually work? And of course, what advantages might we actually see in practice? Because obviously, if we don't get any gains, there's no reason to ever do anything adaptive, but we do see gains here. We'll talk about the FACS implementation of these. Also in keeping with this webinar series, we have template files that will be distributed with the materials after the webinar. So you can take those files and hopefully tweak a few pieces of them and be able to get your RAR or your arm dropping design. And as always, we will be happy to answer questions about how FACS works in particular examples. So feel free to contact us, email, however. We'll also spend a while on advanced topics. So talking about some dose response modeling. I'm going to spend a while on time trends, as this seems to be a major current research area. So I want to talk about what's going on with RAR and arm dropping and time trends. And then finally, talking about platform trials in this context. And finally, we'll conclude with some regulatory comments. So does FDA accept these? The answer is yes. In order to just eliminate all suspense, I will say I've gotten a little annoyed with like news articles that are all, you go on to certain websites and it's all clickbait where the headlines, in order to learn anything, you have to actually click on the link, so to speak. So I'll try not to do that to you. Basically, what our conclusions are going to be here is that RAR and arm dropping are both valuable adaptations. They both perform basically equivalently well if you go to the effort of optimizing both. So there are bad RAR variants, there are bad arm dropping variants, there are good variants of each, and the best RAR and the best arm dropping perform relatively similar. But what you'll also find is that the arm dropping is often a simpler operation. It's simpler to implement, it's simpler to describe, it's simpler to, it's just simpler to do. And so this is often would be my personal recommendation, not because arm dropping is better. It kind of gets under my skin where they're like, oh, you can't do RAR, it performs terribly, which does not appear to be true. But I certainly, if you were telling me I have a phase 3 trial, I would tell you the arm dropping is the simpler route to get through regulatory approval and everything else. All right. So diving in, Doré and Nick, I assume if there are questions in the chat, feel free to interrupt me at any point. The problem that we're solving is we're talking about trials that have multiple arms. I'm going to make a really brief discussion of 2-arm trials during this, but generally speaking, we don't recommend RAR for 2-arm trials, treatment versus control, except in very specific situations. So we're talking about trials that have multiple arms. So these are dose-ranging trials, platform trials investigating multiple therapies, shared control designs. Basically, I want to know, I may have a control, I've got multiple active arms. In those situations, I often want to know what is the best arm. So among many, and I also, keeping in mind, if I'm identifying the best arm, usually there's an implied, I would like to show it's better than the control. So if I have a control in multiple arms, find me the best active arm and tell me if it's better than the control or not. And that's what I want to use going forward. In a dose ranging trial, I may have multiple doses of a drug, find me the best dose, and that's what I'll carry forward into the next phase of development. So that's often a question we want to answer. It's also possible that we want to identify all the effective arms in a particular setting. You can imagine if I'm working at antibiotics, I'm investigating multiple antibiotics at once. I do want to know what the best arm is, but I know that pathogens develop resistance, and I want to find as many things that I can add to the cupboard, so to speak. So if resistance happens to one, I've got another one floating around. So it may be possible I want to know all effective arms, not just the best one. These are going to be different goals, and I may want to handle my adaptations differently because of them. The reason I want to consider adaptation at all is the accumulating data as I run through a trial often indicates that some of these arms are poor choices. And so I may find out, I've got arms A, B, C, and D. I'm partway through the study. Arm B is looking terrible. Well, I don't want to continue allocating to arm B if I already know that it's bad. So allocating less to those poorly performing arms, allocating more to the more promising arms, may allow us to be more efficient. We'll get more patients, participants on the better performing arms, and that would allow us to it will allow us to make a better trial. We'll be more likely to pick the right arm, more likely to make the correct decision that it's better than the control, more likely to make an accurate estimate of a treatment effect. All right, so how do we actually do this? We talked about group sequentials last week, where there were periodic interim analyses. Periodic interim analyses are essentially a mainstay of all adaptive designs. So we'll be looking at the data periodically. Usually this is done by a third party in order to avoid unblinding any data for people who need to remain blinded. At that interim, we would evaluate how well each arm is performing. And we could define how well in a number of different ways. So we could look at the probability that each of the arms is the best. So if I've got arms A, B, C, and D, there may be 4 probabilities. This is the probability arm A is the best, the probability arm B is the best, arm C is the best, arm D is the best. And so those would add up to 100%. This would usually be a Bayesian type quantity. We could look at a posterior probability that each of the arms beats the control. So not just is it the best, not looking at is it the best, but just comparing it to only the control arm. And I could also look at a p-value of each arm versus control. Nothing says you have to be Bayesian in this particular context. And so with those quantities in mind, what we would do is that we would then adjust allocation in favor of the better performing arms. So we increase the allocation to arms that are doing better or best, and we decrease or eliminate allocation to poorly performing arms. Arm dropping is a very aggressive may be the wrong word, but it's an extreme version of this by design. And so in arm dropping, if a metric falls below a certain threshold, that arm is gone. So if you don't have a sufficiently low p-value, we would just drop that arm completely from the study and move on with the remaining arms. RAR is a little bit more flexible. The allocations do change, but you could make that allocation smaller as opposed to making it down to 0. So there are situations where an arm might be allocating, one arm is getting 70% of the observations, another arm's getting 20%, and a third arm's getting 10, would be how RAR might work in practice. So you don't necessarily have to go down to 0. You can, but it's not required. So this is an example of the, to give some of the details of how this might work. Just an example interim with dichotomous data. So I've done a burn-in period in my trial. I've got a control 3 active arms. I've allocated 20 observations to each arm. You can see the number of responses. So 6 out of 20 on control, 5 responses on arm A, 11 on B, 9 on C. So arm B is performing the best, but that's of course just observed data subject to sampling variability. I can compute the probability that each arm is the best. And I'm not including control in here. I'll tell you why in a moment, but usually it's bad to include the control in this. But this is just among the active arms, what is the probability that each of these arms is the best? So really a low likelihood that arm A is the best, 73% chance for arm B, 26% for arm C. So that's one metric. I could compute the probability each arm is greater than the control, superior to control. So arm A, again, not a particularly high posterior probability. Arm B looks pretty good. Arm C, it doesn't look as good as arm B, but it is still looking like it's certainly on the good side of control. And of course, I could also compute a p-value. These are all one-sided p-values versus control. So you can see again, this is a fairly low p-value. It's certainly not 0.025, but it's relatively low, and these are higher. Okay, so if we have these metrics, the next question is, well, how do we translate those metrics into how we allocate patients in the future? And here's where there's all kinds of details on how you might do it. So, I mean, in theory, if I were to describe this as a class of models, any allocation that is a function of these metrics, and you could imagine other metrics, would be classified as an RAR, or if you could drop arms, an arm dropping design. I'm going to talk about some of the common examples that you see in practice. So certainly intended as a very applied talk, a how-to talk. So one thing that we might do is, as we go forward, we may say we're going to allocate another 80 patients. Remember, there are periodic interims. So when we're deciding allocation, we're only deciding what to do until the next interim, at which point we will look at the data again and make new decisions. So I'm going to talk about allocating the next 80 patients. And I may say in that next 80, I'm going to allocate 20 to control. So what I'm doing is I'm keeping my control allocation constant throughout my trial. That's important for reasons I'll get to in a moment. And I'm going to allocate the other 60 patients to the active arms, and I'm going to do this proportionally to the probability that each arm is the best. This is what I would likely do if I was trying to find the best arm and eventually compare it to control. So I would note that arm B is heading out into a good direction. And so I might allocate 73% to arm B, 25.88 to arm C, and 1% to arm A among those 60.
Sure.
Yeah.
We have a question in the Q&A. Someone asked, what is the underlying true assumed rate in the control and research arms?
So I haven't told you what those are. I am going to give simulation results. This was intended to say how you would, how this would work in practice when you actually see an interim and you don't know the true rates. We will, when we get to the simulation results, we will put on true rates and then say how well do these different methods correctly select the right arm and make correct decisions about being better control, power, type 1 error, and so forth. So for the moment, this is data as it would appear to you in practice, of course, without a known truth.
And one more, a few more.
Wow, okay.
How did you select the interim cohort size, the spacing between the interims?
So this would be just a preview of coming attractions. I'll show some work on that. There's a paper where we explore that. This is a burn-in of about 20% of the total sample size, and interims every 20% of the data. So 20%, 40%, 60%, 80, and 100. That's a relatively common choice. This actually, you have the same sort of things that happened in the group sequential last week. You don't want to do things incredibly early. There is a point where, getting one observation per arm is not going to get me, not going to tell me all that much. And you also don't want to do it too late because, of course, if I do a fixed trial and only adapt in the last piece of it, I don't have time for the adaptations to actually help me much. So what we've found is doing a burn-in of 20%, 40% at most seems to work well. And again, doing interims every 20% of the data. Like group sequentials, the more interims you do after the burn-in, the better the performance, but they have diminishing returns. So if I did interims every 10% of the data, as opposed to every 20, I would get better results, but I'm not claiming that they're going to be massively better results.
And one more, then I'll let you go. Can you do the allocation according to probability arm is better than control rather than probability this arm is the best of the active arms? Absolutely.
That's the next slide. So this is to finish this slide. So this 1%, it's reasonable to go, is that going to help me at all? I've got, maybe out of 80 patients, I just get one. It's probably not going to turn around arm A's data. It's just not enough sample size to do it. So in many cases, it may be viewed as not very efficient to allocate a really tiny fraction to an arm. So a lot of times we will threshold small values, for example, less than 5%, less than 10%, to 0 and renormalize them. So that might be take that 1.08 to 0 and proportionally reallocate it to the active arms. Now, related to the question that was just asked, this was a situation, we often do this when we're only interested in finding the best arm. And you can see one of the things we do is, arm C is not looking like a terrible arm, but it's not looking as good as arm B, so it gets less allocation. This kind of allocation that we're doing here, it is good if we want to find the best arm and understand it. But if we want to understand all effective arms, the allocation that I've performed here it's good at the best, but it's not so good at finding the second best or the third best because it moves away from those. And so if your goal is to identify all effective arms, then what you might want to do is do that allocation based on the probability that the arm is better than the control. You could also make this as a function of p-values. There is a clear correlation between the posterior probability and the p-value here. So I may allocate the active arms after normalizing these three probabilities. And you can see in this case, I do lower the allocation to the arm that isn't doing particularly well. But I do arms B and C do have pretty similar allocation in this case. This does better if the second and third best arms are also potentially of interest. Certainly, I'm trying to get rid of arms that don't work or are harmful. But this would be retaining all of any arm that's better than the control. I'm likely to keep allocation to it. So again, it's very important what the goal is and that you match the RAR to your goals. If you don't, you're going to end up with bad performance, and it's not because of the overarching RAR is bad. It's because the RAR variant wasn't a good choice. In doing arm dropping, this is, as we've said, it's simpler. Arm dropping just removes any arm that's performing poorly. So for example, I could stop any arm with a p-value greater than 0.5, which in this case would be arm A. And so that would say my future allocation, if I was going 1-to-1 to 1-to-1 in this burn-in period, I would just drop arm A and I would go from 1 to 0 to 1-to-1. And it's okay if you have some partial blocks here. In implementation, you may have to randomize that last block, but this is not a statistically important issue to go to this. You could certainly also stop arms based on them having a small probability of superiority. As I said, there's often a strong correlation between this probability and the p-value, or a small probability that the arm is best. And you can see this, this does look a little bit simpler. It's easier to describe. I'm just going to get rid of an arm and I'm going to keep everything else going identically. So that's one appeal of arm dropping.
Kurt, how do you choose the p-value for arm stopping? Or I'll translate it to posterior probability for you.
Sorry, I guess I didn't understand the question when you said you'd translate.
How do you choose the p-value for arm stopping is the question.
You mean this like threshold?
The threshold for dropping an arm, yeah.
So there are a number of, you could use group sequential bounds. So there are some fairly standard futility rules for certain p-values to drop at each interim. So there may be a different threshold if you look at the group sequential literature. The other ways to do it, the multi-arm, multi-stage design literature has a number of choices here. So I don't have an extensive discussion in this, but I do have some references in the upcoming slides that talk about how to do this. But essentially, they are acting as arm-specific futility rules. And so that is often how we would pick those.
Kurt, before you move forward, there's one more question from a previous slide. Please explain how the listed allocation probabilities for the probability of the arm is better than control were derived. It was not clear.
So this, I assume this row. So what this is doing, since this is a Bayesian posterior probability, we put non-informative, we put Jeffrey's prior as a beta 0.5, 0.5 on each of the arms. And so this is computing, we would say arm A's rate is a beta 5.5, 15.5. The control rate is a beta 6.5, 14.5. And then this is simply the posterior probability that arm A's rate is greater than the control rate. So the probability that one beta is greater than another. It's actually similar. The probability the arm that's best was computed with the same beta posteriors. It's just for arm B to be the best, arm B would have to not only beat, sorry, these are only with respect to the active, but this, in order to be the best, arm B would have to beat arm A, and it would have to beat arm C. In this case, as I said, control is not part of this calculation, with a reason we'll get to in a moment. All right, so this is going to generate, there are a lot of variants of RAR. I can't talk about all of them. There's been 80 years of these, in addition to using different metrics. So probability of superiority versus probability an arm is the best, in addition to what should the thresholds be, which are questions that have already come up. There are other things that people have thought about, like, well, I'm going to take those probabilities and I'll take the square root of all of them, and then I'll renormalize them. And so that might be a little bit different. How do all those things perform? So there's been about 80 years of research on this particular question, maybe 90, going back to a paper by Thompson, I think in the 1930s. This is a nice review article that just came out in Statistical Science by David Robertson and colleagues. Response adaptive randomizations from myths to practical considerations. So this is a review article of a lot of that work. And there are a number of commentaries on it. I do have one of these commentaries to self-advertise a little bit. We basically wrote the in practice, since we've done a lot of these trials. But you can see a review and various theoretical and methodological considerations in the commentaries. So this certainly goes through in more detail than I can on what the various options are.
Kurt, we have a question that sort of relates to that. What should be our metric bullet? Do Bayes factors ever get used in allocation rules instead of p-values? And maybe just elaborate on the different quantities that you can actually use to get your allocation.
So I have not actually seen Bayes factors, but there wouldn't be any problem with using them. I would suspect, if you mean Bayes factors of each arm relative to the control, I would assume, of course, this probability involves the Bayes factor and the prior. So I would think that the Bayes factor would be a key part and be highly correlated with using this value. Of course, for the probability arm is best, you've got comparisons to multiple arms on there. And sorry, Nick, I forgot the second part of the question.
No, that answered the question. It's perfect.
All right, so let's see. Okay, so while there are a gazillion different kinds of metrics here and how you could put bells and whistles, I do want to talk about some big themes which come up over and over again. These are things you should always keep in mind, even when you're kind of down into the details. These are big picture things that come up in the literature and worth remembering. So notice I said I wasn't going to mess with the control allocation. So I wasn't going to make it part of the adaptations. In a lot of the earlier versions of RAR, what they would do is to go back a couple slides, when they computed the probability that the arm was the best, the control was part of this calculation. And so what could happen is while you were running the study, you could decrease the allocation to control. And so that creates some problems. One of the problems that it creates is it tends to dramatically reduce the power of your study. So there's a kind of a theme here. If you need to compare to control at some point, so you may be searching for the best arm, but if it's a dose ranging study, I do want to know the best dose, but I need to know, is it better than placebo or standard of care or whatever I'm comparing to? So if that control is going to be in a comparison at some point, you do want to maintain allocation to control throughout the trial. You don't want to reduce it. And the reason is fairly straightforward. So you can think about a situation where suppose I did reduce the control allocation. So this might be what equal allocation does. And then this would be a version of RAR where the control is reduced, but some of the arms do have increased allocation. If I just compute the variance of my treatment effect estimate, this might be, if you're doing adaptations, there's usually some corrections for the adaptation, but certainly this would count for a posterior variance of that treatment effect. If I'm allocating 100 per arm, that variance might look like 1/100 plus 1/100. And of course, there's a sigma squared that goes in here, but it drops out. Anyway, this is all relative. So that variance might be 0.02 for comparing, say, treatment C to control. If I come over here, I've got a whole bunch of patients on treatment C. Hey, that's good. I'm bringing more patients into the comparison, but I have reduced patients on control. And suppose that this is 50 patients and this is now 200. So I have 50 and 200. I've got, you could sit there and go, oh, I've got 250 patients in that comparison. That's more than 200. That's a good thing. But the ratio matters here. So the variance of my treatment effect is 1/50 plus 1/200, and that's 0.025, which is actually higher than the fixed equal allocation was doing. So this is a reason you can actually, if you've got to make a comparison to control, that variance of the control arm is going to appear in your estimates of treatment effect. You need controls. So the usual advice here is don't ever touch this control allocation, or make it bigger is a possibility. But then what you're doing is, so this piece of the comparison is held constant, and then again, I could increase my allocation to the best active arm. And then when I do this, I would get 1/100 plus 1 over something bigger than 100. And then I would end up reducing the variance of those treatment effects. So essentially, you do want to be careful of this. And if you read a lot of the previous kind of negative literature on RAR, they're all perfectly correct. But this is not a statement of RAR is bad. It's a statement of doing RAR this way is bad. Similarly to how, a surgeon can do a very good surgery, but me doing a surgery is not going to be recommended. Doesn't mean surgery is bad. It just means I am not a licensed surgeon in any way, shape, or form. One aspect of this, so this is one of the main reasons that we don't recommend doing 2-arm RAR if you just have a control and treatment. We do this very rarely. There are some situations where we care very much about the allocation of patients in the trial, and there may be reasons for that. But if you're really interested in generalizing your results outside the trial, having decent power, having decent estimates of treatment effect is valuable. And so in 2-arm RAR, there's no way not to adjust the control. The treatment and control, if you change one of them, you increase the treatment, you've got to decrease the control. So we recommend just do this 1-to-1, or if 2-to-1 makes sense or whatever, but just keep it constant, run a group sequential kind of design, and do early stopping as we talked about last week. Here are some papers that the first 3 of these are good descriptions of why these all have reduced allocation to control and show why that's a bad thing. This last paper compares the 2 of those. I think I've got on the next slide. There is a description here. So this is from that last paper in 2020. So going back a slide, this clinical trials paper here. What we did in this paper is we wanted to look at different variants of RAR. And so some of these, and we can compare them to fixed trials. So what you can see here is in this, like this particular panel is the power of the study. And the x-axis is just different scenarios. So the nugget is a situation, we've got multiple arms and one of them works and the rest of the arms are nulls. The text in here is showing the power for different designs. And so, for example, the F40, F25, F50, these are the power for fixed designs. So this would be a fixed design where 40% of the participants go to control, fixed design 25% go to control, fixed design 50% go to control. And it does look like there is a kind of optimal control allocation, which is kind of well known in multiple arm trials. The other pieces of this is this R adjust control. This is an RAR design where you allow the control allocation to drop. And so you can see this actually does worse than the fixed designs. So a little bit less power here. In this other scenario, it's dramatically reduced power. So this ends up, it does a worse job about picking the best arm. This particular paper also shows mean square error of estimation. This R adjust control design does bad all over the place. So this is not recommended. This certainly is not the first paper to make this observation. In contrast, these designs up at the top, which are overlaying each other, these are all variants of RAR which maintain control allocation and just mess with the allocation of the active arms. And you can see they do tend to beat the fixed designs, and they do it on better arm selection, better mean square error of estimation, better treatment of patients in the trial. This particular paper, there's no comparison to arm dropping. I'll get to that in a moment. So anyway, lesson 1, be careful about your control allocation. Second lesson that comes up often is you need to be careful not to adapt too early or too aggressively. So you can imagine a fairly extreme version of this. Suppose my dichotomous example where I had 20 patients per arm. Suppose I adapted on the basis of 2 observations per arm, so some really low number. What you'll find is that especially if you do that aggressively. So, suppose I got 0 out of 2 and I immediately dropped the allocation probability very low. That's hard to recover from. So the interesting thing about RAR is you can recover from a random high. So if the RAR probabilities go up, what's going to happen is you'll put more observations on the arm with the random high, and the random high will likely regress to its true mean, and potentially you can, some of that will be mitigated. Random lows are worse. They're harder to deal with. If you overreact to a random low, you're not going to put many patients on that arm. It doesn't have the ability to recover and get back to its true mean. You basically never get any more signal. And so you need to be careful about how early do you put interims in and how aggressive are the allocation rules. As a sidebar here, you also, if you're doing really early interims, you need to be careful about Bayesian priors, because certain priors can lead to really aggressive allocation rules. Our general recommendation is to do a decent sized burn-in. So again, 20 to 40% of the population, and that's usually enough to avoid this issue of adapting too early or too aggressively. So again, this paper is repeated. It's got a lot of nice features telling you how not to do RAR. So this is an adapting too early and too aggressively is shown to be bad in this particular case. We also have written, this is not the same 2020 paper. We've written another paper that talks about when to put the burn in. So in this paper, this farm stat paper, we looked at several different metrics for adaptation. So, probability arm is best. I shouldn't say several. We looked at 2. That's several yeah, I shouldn't have said several. We looked at the probability arm is best, and we looked at the probability the arm is greater than the control. We looked at the number of interims in the trial. Again, the starting interim location, how long is the burn-in? And we looked at different versions on thresholding to 0. So remember in that first example, we had that 1.08%. And we said, what's the point of allocating 1% of the patients? We're going to make it 0. So we looked at less and more aggressive ways to do that. No claims that this is complete. We certainly tried to do a lot of the common things we see in practice, but I'm not claiming that this is every possible thing that you could do, or that we, pick the right thresholds for all of the dimensions of the problem.
Okay, let me jump in, Kurt.
Yep.
First question is, rather than increasing the overall total number of patients in the best arm during RAR, can you finish and report the arm earlier?
Could you just have early stopping? Yes, and usually we do have early stopping criteria on this, so that if the arm that is, for example, doing the best already is beating control, you might just do early stopping. And that's what we would do in practice. In a lot of the papers that we write, I've never actually seen, if somebody could prove this theorem, I would much appreciate it. In our practical work, what we have usually found, and I would say always, Nick, remind me if you know of a counterexample. Anytime you've got a situation where one design does better than another at an equal sample size, you can almost always translate that into that design getting equal performance at a lower sample size. So doing better at the same sample size and doing equal at a lower sample size are reasonably equivalent in practice. I'm going to say I think they're almost always equivalent, but I have no theorem to that effect. Nick, you have comments on that?
No, I agree with that.
So a lot of times when we're writing papers, it's easier. What we always worry about when we write papers is when we start to put stopping rules on top of all the other things we're comparing, we're worried the stopping rules will make things not apples to apples. And so we often go back to the fixed sample size to try to eliminate the dimension. But certainly in practice, we would say if an arm looks like, we have one, we do this a lot in stage designs, where if we're looking for a dose, we may say, once we're confident we know what the dose is, let's just go to the stage. If I'm doing a phase 2-3, we may stop the phase 2 early and go into the phase 3 piece. Absolutely.
Okay, one more here. Once you calculate the RAR probabilities, are block sizes for randomization kept constant? So this is about stratification using RAR and how to do this in implementation. Are block sizes kept constant? Are they changed as randomization ratios change to ensure balanced randomization across stratification factors? Any comments on that generally?
Yeah, so you can do essentially whatever you'd prefer operationally on block sizes. Keep in mind, you may not have things divide exactly equally, but you could absolutely change the block size. You could keep it equal. The fact certainly allows you to tweak the block size. If you have stratification variables, we often don't simulate those because we can often find power, et cetera, without them. But in practice, if you were trying to stratify randomization, there are some papers on doing covariate adaptive randomization, trying to equal out covariate distributions while doing RAR. I know my colleague Ben Seville has done some of these in practice. I think he's written a paper on this. I don't think he's on, but I certainly know other people have also addressed this problem. I've got some colleagues at MUSC that know about doing this kind of stuff. So anyway, this is certainly, you can add operational considerations with block sizes and stratification on top of this when you implement the trial without change in performance. All right, and the last piece of this is what I will say repeatedly is match your design choices to your goals. So again, the main place this often comes into play is if I care most about the best arm, driving the design by the probability the arm is best is the thing to do. If you're trying to identify all useful arms, then this posterior probability or the p-value may be more useful. And again, keep in mind, more useful may be, kind of not strong enough. You can end up in situations where the alternative is bad. If you're doing probability arm is best, then the second and third best arms are going to have poor performance. If you are looking for the best arm, then doing the probability the arm is greater than the control, that can actually have fairly decently reduced power, for example. And that's in some of those 2020 papers. So make sure you do both of them and make sure you know what the trade-offs are. Make sure when you do, simulate both of them. This is again in that Robertson paper. Here's a good example for probability arm greater than the control. Lorenzo Trippa and colleagues. This is Journal of Clinical Oncology in 2012. So this is a nice, Lorenzo's got a number of papers on RAR. This one's on glioblastoma. He's running a nice platform trial right now as well. So all of that work I would recommend. I'm not going to talk a lot about arm dropping because for the most part, I don't have to. Arm dropping is just simpler. You do want to, the same principles apply. So the discussion we just had still is important. Usually the control allocation is maintained automatically. So it's not that it's not important, but it's just automatically done. We never even think about reducing the control. You do want to avoid aggressive early stopping. So, you don't want to set up where, you just had 0 out of 2 responses. You're out of the study. That could, of course, eliminate a good arm for random early bad luck. Don't do that. And again, match the driver of your arm dropping to the goal of the study. This is a nice paper. This is, again, Lorenzo and James Wazen on a comparison of Bayesian adaptive randomization. And this is to, it was a long title, but to multi-arm, multi-stage designs. And so this is in statistics and medicine. So this has some discussion on modern arm dropping work and some comparisons here. So another nice paper. If you actually were to compare arm dropping to RAR, what you will find is as long as you have done those principles where you're handling control right, you've matched your driver of adaptation to your goals, you're not being silly about doing things too early. So basically, you've got a good RAR design, you've got a good arm dropping design. We've got some work on doing this. It's under actually a second revision. We hope it will come out soon. We can write some stuff on this paper in more detail with some blog posts and such. But essentially what we find in this paper, we compared fixed designs to various forms of arm dropping and one form of RAR. The reason we only had one form of RAR is all of the other RAR variants we might consider were in prior papers. So there were already existing literature comparisons. What you can see here is, for example, for power, the RAR is in red, the arm droppings are in various other colors, fixed is in black. Everything is beating fixed, but the arm dropping and RAR, they are all doing reasonably well on power. You can see there are good arm dropping procedures for getting a good sample size on the selected arm. Actually, the arm dropping beats the RAR by a little bit here. Ironically, the RAR beats arm dropping on selecting the best arm. This was a little unintuitive. See the paper. But again, these aren't dramatic differences. These are just a little bit one way and a little bit the other. But anyway, and the difference is the arm dropping that does bad here. These are situations where we're illustrating the driver doesn't match the goals again. So certainly this is, in many cases, it's just the wrong arm dropping. But again, in general, what you find is the best arm dropping and the best RAR are about equal. Again, it gets under my skin a little bit when people say RAR is bad, but a theme here is I do find arm dropping right now to be a bit simpler. I've been told by our implementation colleagues it's easier to implement. And so this is more my arm dropping right now is more my default until I see more work on RAR. So hopefully that is not me flip-flopping, but that is me learning over time what works and what doesn't. Okay, so let's spend a little time on facts. Nick, any questions while I switch screens here?
You've answered most of them. There was a question comment about using it's a technique called CARA, C-A-R-A, covariate adjusted response adaptive randomization. And I know Sophia has published a paper on CARA, and Aon, who asked the question, actually, I've seen a paper of his about the topic. And so there are existing methodologies for doing covariate adjustment with RAR. And yeah, and if you have anything to add to that, to existing sort of covariate adjustment strategies, that was the idea of the question.
And no, I am not the right person to ask, aside from the only thing I know about that, aside from the raw basics, is I know who to ask. But I do know it has been done.
And Kurt, we see your screen and looks like your fax application.
Okay. All right. So let's see. So I've got 3 files here. And again, these are all intended to be templates. I'll start with, actually, I have one for the fixed comparison. So this is a 240 patient trial. I'm assuming a quick endpoint here, but fax will certainly handle delayed endpoints. I've got a control and 4 doses. Don't need that. I'm considering a null scenario, a situation where one of the arms works well and the others are nulls. And finally, a mixed scenario where each of the arms is a different rate. This dose 4, arm 4, is the best one here. I'm using an independent, I'm not doing any kind of modeling over doses. So these are all handled independently. So the order doesn't matter. You'll get equivalent performance. Because it's a quick endpoint, the accrual doesn't matter. I don't have any dropouts. The quantities of interest, so I've tried to set up in this template file everything we've talked about. So you can see posterior probability that an arm beats the control, a p-value comparing arms, and the probability that each arm is the best. Also, decision quantities based on those 3 are already pre-populated for you in the template. This particular design, again, all independently modeled. It's got a prior. This prior essentially assumes a uniform distribution on each probability. It's a normal 0-2 on the log odds, but that's approximates the uniform, not quite, but close. I'm just allocating 2 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 here. That has power advantages in a fixed trial to do a little bit more to control. And what I've done is I've got a Bonferroni correction. So at the end of the trial, my probability that I am beating the control needs to be greater than 0.99375. So just a Bonferroni 0.025 over my 4 arms pulled out of that. And that's pretty much necessary. You can, obviously with the Dunnits, you can make it a little bit more lax, but not all that much. If I simulate this, you can see I do have type 1 error control. 0.022 for my type 1 error. Remember, there's simulation error attached to this. I think it actually is closer to 0.025 if I ran a much bigger simulation. You'll also notice the power here. In the nugget, it's 66%. In the mixed scenario, it's 70%. So I've got not the best power here. Fax will also give you, in addition to the power, you can see the allocation that happens over time. So of course, this is a fixed trial. So I am allocating 2 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. So you can see, the allocation is indeed equal on the active arms. And you can also see what arm is selected. So in the nugget, it's actually a really easy. It almost always selects the right arm. But the issue is, of course, the power is lower because while it knows which arm is the best, it can't always decide, is it better than the control accurately? In the mixed scenario, you can see that, again, the allocation is constant, but the target selection, you can again see there's some variability here. So, a little over 80% chance that I'll select the best arm here. A little bit of a note here. This comes up on bias. So this is the average response. It looks like it's unbiased. So the average estimated response matches the truth. This is true if you consider every trial. But for the most part, what we're often interested in we're interested in the treatment effect when we select dose 4. And in that case, it reflects some cherry picking. And so if I only focused on the 80% of trials when I go forward, then I'm going to get a bias here from cherry picking the arm. So that's an important thing to keep in mind on just what this number actually means here. All right, so fixed is easy. If I do RAR, so we've got a template here. Most of this is going to be identical, 240 patients, same scenarios, same execution, same quantities of interest. The only thing that's changed here is in the design, I have added interims. So starting at 20% of the data, and I've actually gone every 10% for the interims. Going every 20 is pretty constant. This doesn't gain me a ton over less frequent interims. I've got for my, I forgot to allocation. I forgot to actually show you the RAR piece. So I've got adaptive allocation here. This is based on the probability that each arm is the best. There's blocking information. So as we talked about, FACS will let you block in a number of ways. So I have said, for example, this is what I'm going to do in the burn-in, 168888. And what's going to happen is after the burn-in, I'm going to have blocks of size 6. I'm going to allocate 2 of them to the control, and I'm going to allocate the rest of the participants in each block according to this probability of being the max. This allows for thresholding to 0. If you want to raise things to a power, you can do that. I actually, if you're doing everything else well, I found raising to a power to actually not be incredibly helpful. If you're doing everything else badly, sometimes raising it to a power makes you do it a little less badly, but that's a side issue. All right, I think that's all. This is the success criteria. Notice it's changed. I haven't quite used the Bonferroni correction anymore. The reason for that is RAR has a built-in multiplicity fighter. Remember, multiplicities are caused, I've got several arms, I can get random highs. If you get a random high in RAR, it allocates more patients to that arm and gives it more chance to regress to its mean. The net result is it tends to mitigate random highs, not saying perfectly, but more than not doing RAR. And so you can pull this threshold down a little bit. And you can see in this case, I've got much higher power. So the power here used to be about 66 and it's now 87. This power used to be 70 and it's now 83. So I'm really getting an advantage. I get the big advantage in the nugget because the RAR quickly realizes that one arm is better than the other and it piles a lot of subjects on it and gets me an advantage there. And you can see that in the graphs. So my subject allocation, again, you can see it's really identified the nugget and put a lot of subjects there. And so you can get an idea about what is, how effective the RAR is. In the mixed scenario, same situation. I've got a lot more subjects on dose 4 than on these other arms. And again, that's where part of where the increased power is coming from. And again, this, while it looks a little bit biased, if you focus on when arm 4 is selected, the bias from RAR is actually less than the bias from the fixed design. So if you look at all trials, the fixed one is, of course, unbiased. But if you focus on, what do I care about when I'm saying use the drug or go to phase 3, in those situations, I get a better estimate on the label or a better estimate of my phase 3 effect when I'm doing RAR. And then finally, we've got an arm dropping design and a template here. All of this file looks identical to the past two, except all I've done is tweaked in the allocation tab. So I've changed this from adaptive allocation to arm dropping, and I have said I'm going to drop any arm for which the probability that it's the maximum is less than 10%. And obviously I'd need to, is 5% better? Is 20% better? I would generally run those different possibilities and figure that out. If you go to the simulation results, these power numbers are essentially identical to what I saw in RAR. And if you look at the other graphs, you also get relatively identical performance. So again, arm dropping, good RAR are both doing good things for you, especially compared to a fixed trial. All right, Nick, any questions?
Okay, Kurt, we did get a question.
Perfect, because I'm having technical difficulties, which I am solving.
Was there a comment on the choice of the frequency for making adaptive randomization changes? And would adapting frequently, for example, after every patient, be bad? And bad is in air quotes.
It would not be bad. It would be. It would not be incredibly good. Is what the issue is. Adding more interims will always increase your performance as long as you do them semi-intelligently. But what will happen is they're diminishing returns. So doing it every patient as opposed to every 2 likely is identical. Every 4 is likely identical. Going from 2 interims to 4 interims is going to get you a benefit. The other thing that will come up is interims do come with an operational cost. And so you need to be able to actually make that happen. Nick, do you want to talk about Principle for a second?
Sure. Principle was a platform trial in the UK, a COVID platform trial performed in the UK. It randomized over 10,000 patients over its 2 or so years accruing. And we did interim analyses approximately weekly for a long time. And there's RAR conducted at those interim analyses. And, we're getting hundreds to 200s of patients per week, essentially, at the peak. And so doing RAR that frequently actually sort of kept us on track. a lot of the times, and it was, weekly, but didn't seem like it was too fast at all. And we ended up doing over 50 updates throughout the course of the trial. So we have been known to do RAR updates pretty frequently at times. And Principal actually, interestingly, did use blocks to randomize after RAR. And so we at each interim analysis would go through and calculate the appropriate block size that minimized the difference from the desired RAR probabilities, by breaking them into as small as blocks as possible without deviating too much from the estimated rates.
All right. So hopefully I'm back in business. Some bells and whistles here. Dose response modeling. This was actually one of the initial primary uses for RAR. We'd run studies with 10 to 15 doses and do RAR. We certainly still do, but it's not our only use of RAR anymore. Probably platforms and other cases we now do more often. But certainly if you have doses, you can connect those with a dose response model. An Emax model is common. If you don't want monotonicity, you can do some kind of smoother. This is a normal dynamic linear model, which is common in the Bayesian literature, but certainly other alternative smoothers are possible. And again, the goal of that dose response is to combine information across doses, and you can manage to do better than if you treat the doses independently. There's a good example of this by Byron Gajewski. This is in Statistics in Medicine in 2019, if you'd like to have a look at that. That's a version of an Emax model. FACS does provide many dose responses, so lots of different options. If you're doing arm dropping when you have doses, arm dropping can be implemented with appropriate constraints. A lot of times if you have doses and they're ordered, you don't want to just, drop the middle dose. It's awkward. Why do you think the middle dose is bad, but the next lower and the next higher both should be kept? And so you can say, I only want to drop the doses in order from the bottom or in order from the top. Those are various things you can add. And then finally, FACS will also perform what we'll call a pretty standard phase 2-3 design, where you start off with a number of doses. At some point, you perform a dose selection and you go to a confirmatory stage. This is the stage design engine, and we actually have an upcoming webinar is all about this particular piece, because this is common.
Okay, Kurt, I'm going to jump in. Sorry.
Yep.
Have you or anyone explored the benefits of RAR varying the recruitment rate and or the time to endpoint, the time of response assessment?
So of course, those are going to be, it's only the ratio between those that matter.
Yeah.
So if you accrue, the key issue is how many patients are incomplete at any given time. So if you're enrolling 2 patients a week on a 1-week endpoint, doing 20 patients a week on a, flip the ratio around, as long as you get the same proportion of incomplete patients, the design will perform identically. It certainly does matter if you accrue very, very fast and most of your patients are incomplete. You may not have information to do RAR or arm drop. Generally speaking, if you accrue really, really fast, you can't do anything adaptive at all. If you accrue very, very slowly, that tends to maximize the benefit of all adaptations. And you do have to be careful. The type 1 error rate, if you're using simulation to control it, you do have to consider what your anticipated accrual is, and consider a window around that, recognizing you may not get your accrual estimates exactly right. All right, last big topic, the time trends. So one thing that happens is with RAR is you're altering the allocation ratio. So what happens if the arms are actually changing in performance as the trial goes on? So this is a simple example where in the first half of the trial, I have means of 50, 70, and 60 for control and 2 active arms. And in the second half, everything goes up by 20. So this is an additive effect. Everybody gets better. We saw this in the COVID trials, where after adjusting for covariates, a lot of the effects did look additive. Different variants just made everybody sicker or less sick. While we didn't adjust in a lot of ways, it's also been suggested that, say, number of hospital utilization might be a key issue, especially when the endpoint was, are patients hospitalized? Because, of course, if the hospital's full, they're more likely to send you home. When the hospital's empty, they may be more likely to admit you, just because they've got they have to have a bed. Really, they have to have staff, but we'll call it a bed. All right. So the nice thing about this is, suppose that you weren't changing allocation ratios. So I'm basically saying, why haven't we worried about this problem so much in the past? Well, if I just allocate 100 patients per arm per time period, then what I'm going to get is 100 patients at the 50 on control. I'm going to get another 100 patients on the 70 at control. And my control mean is going to average about 60. For arm A, I'm going to average the 70 and the 90. I'm going to get 80. And if I take that expected mean difference for the treatment effect, it's 20. And that is the difference between arm A and control. So even though I've got this additive time effect, once I take the differences, it all comes out in the wash. Now, I certainly may want to model time to reduce the variance of my estimates, but I don't need them to remove the bias. If I'm doing RAR, this breaks if I'm not careful. And the reason is, so suppose I allocated 100 patients to each arm in the first half, but then I did an interim for RAR and I allocate 100, 150, and 50 in the second half. What that's going to do is the control ends up being equally allocated between the 2 time periods. So I get a mean of 60 as I did before, but now arm A has more patients in the second half when patients were getting higher means. And so that means that I'm a little more weighted towards that 90. And I'm going to get a mean for arm A of 82. If I estimate the treatment effect, I'm going to average 22, and I'm biased a bit high in this case. The amount of bias, of course, depends on what the time effect is, how extreme the change in allocation is. All of this is going to go into play. You can get smaller or larger biases, but you are going to get biases if you just do these naive, just straight treatment mean difference comparisons. So we need to be careful. This is also from that same current work under revision. These are type 1 errors for different methods. So for example, if you do RAR, you can see you can get type 1 errors instead of a desired 2.5%. Here's 5.7. Here's 4.7. They're inflated. So that's the bias translating into problems, and it does depend on the direction of the bias. So you can get inflated type 1 errors, you can get deflated type 1 errors, depending on how the things vary over time. But you certainly can't guarantee control of type 1 error, which is a bad thing. If you'll notice from this graph, some of the arm dropping designs inflate type 1 error. You do have to be arm dropping often is again simpler, but you do have to be careful of time trends here. If I started 2 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1, it would be okay for me to drop a couple of these arms and go to 4 to 0 to 2 to 0 to 2. I've dropped these two arms, but the key thing is I've maintained this 2 to 1 ratio is the same as this 4 to 2 ratio. I could have done 2 to 0 to 1 to 0 to 1, whatever would happen to work for your preferred block sizing. But the key is that I've maintained the ratio of control to treatment. If I were to do something a little bit different, where I say, well, I just want to maintain a constant control rate. So, 2 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1, that's 1/3 control. If I said, well, I'm just going to continue to do that and go 2 to 0 to 2 to 0 to 2, then I've broken this ratio. It was 2 to 1 at the beginning, and now it's 2 to 2 later in the trial. That's going to create an asymmetry in between the time periods. If there are changes, my weighted average is going to be preferentially weighted towards one time period or another, and that will get you biases. So again, it's this ratio that you're maintaining that's important here. Arm dropping often does that automatically, but there are variants of arm dropping you got to be careful about. Now, fortunately, this problem is fixable. So this is an additive time trend. All of the arms are going up by 20. And as long as you're in this situation where all of the arms move equally, and again, this is move equally after accounting for covariates. So if you have to put in a variant of COVID or hospital utilization, this is after those variables are accounted for. So if you have an additive time trend, you can just put in an additive time effect, and it will get rid of all of those biases. Kinda. I should be careful. If you have multiple arms, this works great. But 2-arm RAR, again, has problems. And the reason is it goes back to this changing the control allocation. If one of the arms is dropping out of the study, and so later in the study, only one arm is represented, you don't have enough information left to properly estimate the time effects. So in 2-arm RAR, this model actually, it's not that it breaks per se, but it usually you can't estimate time very well. In multiple arm studies where you maintain control, you can estimate these time effects and you're okay. So again, some recent work on both of this. This is a 2-arm. Again, we don't do 2 arms, but this shows what happens in a 2-arm RAR with time trends. This is a nice paper by Marta Farig and colleagues. This particular paper is on this kind of modeling. It involves non-concurrent platform controls, but the math's identical for RAR. The key issue is just the changing allocation ratio and the fact that this is non-concurrent controls as opposed to RAR. It doesn't change the math. So this is from our ongoing work. Again, if you put that additive model in, your type 1 errors are controlled. There's a little bit of simulation error in this, but they are all controlled type 1 errors here. And again, additivity is the key assumption in this. If the treatment effects vary over time, so that's going to make your life very difficult. So if one arm works well in May and poorly in August, and you don't have any covariate that explains that, that is very hard to deal with. And I think we're still working on that problem. Some questions are just the general science of this. What are we trying to estimate? If the treatment effect varies over time, there is no the treatment effect. There's only a treatment effect at time X. And so how do we mean to generalize from our current trial to a different time? What does that all mean? What assumptions are we willing to put on it? And this paper I just mentioned, it also talks about the difficulties of these interactive time trends. Final quick topic here, platform trials. There's an interesting discussion that in a fixed horizon trial where you are, I'm only going to enroll 240 subjects. RAR and arm dropping can often be thought as you're reducing the allocation to a certain arm and increasing the allocation to others. In a platform trial where the trial is going to go on perpetually, RAR can be used in a different way where you can prioritize certain arms, where you can say this arm is doing better, I'm going to increase allocation to it, which will allow it to finish faster. And while I'm slowing down another arm, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to hit this fixed horizon and not fully explore it. I could say I'm going to accelerate an arm, get it done, and then I'll come back to the other arm as needed. And so these could be viewed as prioritizing arms rather than changing the total allocation. And so this is a research topic at the moment. I think I've talked about all the regulatory notes here. FDA will accept adaptive designs. Usually you have to do type 1 error control by simulation. There's no question the arm dropping is usually the simpler route. It's easier to explain. And certainly as you're doing this, remember there's a lot of difference between variants of RAR. You need to simulate the one that you're proposing. It's often very difficult to go, this paper did something different, but I'm sure it'll work the same. That's often a hard generalization to make. And if you want some papers on some trials that have done this, in our discussion, we mentioned several trials that have been through regulatory review, have resulted in approvals of drugs, not all of them, but some of them. And there are references to those practical trials in this paper. So I think, again, thank you for attending. We'll be sending out links to the recording. Tom is on vacation. So we will, it might be a little bit delayed this week, but we will get that out. And again, follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and we do produce a variety of free materials. So thank you. DeRay?